it's pro forma to say thank you and how grateful the speaker is for everybody to turn out, but it's actually an enduring source of mystery to me that people are so gracious and generous with their time to come to events like this. We all have so many things to do and so many demands on our lives, and each time, whether I'm the speaker or just doing something involved, I just cannot articulate the gratitude that I always feel that people are willing to just show up and just support events like this. It really is a restorative of hope in the human spirit and in human nature, that people are so kind and gracious with their time. So thank you very, very much for coming. I also just want to recognize Archbishop Smith here this evening, and I'll tell you a little starter story out of school. We sit on the board of the Catholic Organization for Life and Family. We had a board meeting a couple of weeks ago, and Archbishop Smith nudged me with his elbow and said, "We have a very small agenda, you'll have to talk a lot." The agenda was 45 pages long, by which he meant, shut up, don't keep talking, just button it up. So I will take his advice as read this evening as well, and try to get through this as quickly as I can, rather than carry on. So I'm going to talk about hope, and I want to talk about hope in a very kind of broad sense, and then in the question and answer afterwards, if there are specifics that you want to ask me questions about, things about the media and so on, I'm absolutely delighted to answer any questions that you might have or engage in discussion afterwards. So just about 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, a very good friend of mine, Andrei Potworowski, asked me if I'd heard about a near riot that had broken out at Ottawa's luxurious Chateau Laurier Hotel. Some of you, if you visited Ottawa or seen the pictures at the head of the canal, you know it. And I professed I had not heard a thing about it. I didn't know anything about it. And so he proceeded to enlighten me. He said that they had a convention of international chess masters at the hotel. And I allowed myself to trust him, even though the opening line sounded like a setup to me. So he went on to explain that they had set up a conference room where the chess masters came, and they were playing their games, and everything was fine for a couple of days. But then the chess masters got bored with being in the room, so they spilled out into the lobby of the Chateau Laurier, and they started playing their games there, which was, it was a little bit disruptive for some of the other guests, but it wasn't too bad. Until they started, every time they won, they would get up and they would march around, "I am the best, I am the master, I am the master chess player." And it began to be very, very disruptive for the people, the guests in the hotel. So finally the manager came out into the lobby. Andrei's telling me all this. And he heard the complaints, and he told these chess masters to stop. They would have to stop, or he would have them bodily removed from the hotel. And they weren't going to be pushed around like pawns, so this confrontation erupted. And a hail of bishops bombarded the manager, and he had to retreat into his office, but then he fought his way back out. Finally, it got so bad that the police were called. And Andrei claimed, I didn't see it, but he claimed that there was a story in the Ottawa Citizen about it, and that a reporter had asked the manager if he hadn't gone just a little bit overboard and perhaps should have let the players play on. And he claimed that there was a quote from the manager, "Look, this is a high-class hotel. We can't have chestnuts boasting in an open foyer." Yeah, it's a really terrible joke. It's a really terrible joke. But I tell you that joke not just because of my own sick personal delight in terrible, terrible puns. And I actually reminded Andrei when he told me that 2/3 of a pun is PU, of course. And not even just to indulge the memory of my personal delight in the person who told it to me. And I say memory because at the time that Andrei told me that joke, and 100 others that were equally bad. He was dying of a cancer that he thought he had beaten. He left us not long after, and the very last time I saw him, he was still telling jokes that were of the most willfully lame humor imaginable, but he was still telling those jokes. And he wasn't doing that just as a deflection to avoid facing what we all knew was coming. Andre was an incredibly intelligent and educated guy. He was a Harvard-educated PhD. He had an MBA. He was an entrepreneur. He was a professor. And he genuinely loved jokes. He genuinely loved jokes. Not just the punchlines of jokes, but the mechanics and the music of jokes, the way you enter into a joke, the rhythm and the timing of the words, the creation of an expectation within the joke. And that, I think, and what I'm going to argue, the point I'm going to try to make, is really the nature of that expectation that we find in something as simple as a joke is really what hope is all about. And I've thought a lot about that intertwining of humor with hope since Andre slipped towards death and then, as I say, left us. I haven't really stopped thinking about it since he died. And a conclusion that I keep coming back to, and this is going to sound a bit funny, but I mean it with the deepest reverence and charity, love for the faith that is our hope, is the way Christianity itself, our faith, is itself the paradigm of a universal joke. My beloved G.K. Chesterton, the great British journalist from the Edwardian era up into the 1930s, once said, all the jokes about men sitting down on their hats are really theological jokes. They are concerned with the dual nature of man. They refer to the primary paradox that man is superior to all the things around him and yet is at their mercy. We're entering a time of year, of course, where our memory and our understanding reminds us of the source of true mercy that rescues us from being at the mercy of the things of the world. We are reminded and renewed by the reflection that its incarnation bore the same form of inverted expectation that every joke relies upon. In place of raw cosmic world-saving power was a little Jewish girl whose young soul so magnified the Lord that she submitted herself with not my will but thine be done, and accepted bearing in conditions of almost unimaginable duress the Savior of the world who would be born in rags. If that isn't an inversion of expectations, I don't know what is. And yet that's the same mechanics that every joke ultimately relies on. Jokes overturn our expectations through words that use the mirror magic of our verbal imaginations to turn boasting chess masters into roasting chestnuts. Christianity overturns the world through the lens of faith that reveals the one true word as reality. And it's the release of saving laughter, which is really the joyful music of hope, that is our authentic response. That laughter does not preclude us asking exactly what kind of hope we're talking about. I think it's an essential question. What do we mean when we talk about hope? What is hope? How do we invest our hope? What is it? As Christians, we know in what we place our hope. But what do we mean by it? How does it manifest itself in our lives? How, as Catholics, do we make sure the hope of our faith is firmly grounded in the love of reason? The older I get, the more I realized the younger I should have started turning to St. Thomas. And I now realize it's never a bad place to start, to turn to the dumb ox for great wisdom. And in his catechetical instructions, St. Thomas goes into a lot of detail about why Christ descended into hell. And one of the reasons he comes up with is this beautiful phrase, so he might perfectly deliver all his friends. I love that phrase because it combines the almost impenetrable abstraction of the salvation of the entire cosmos, the entire universe, with the very specific, very concrete, very directed act of saving this beautiful phrase, his friends. And those friends are named in the catechetical instructions as Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and David, and this is the part I love the most, and all other just and good men. Then St. Thomas asks, what may we learn from this? That since Christ dwelt among his friends in this world and delivered them by his death, so he wished to visit his friends in hell and deliver them also. What may we learn from that? And he answers very quickly, a firm hope in God, no matter how much one is afflicted. And I think that for all of us who are involved in the life of faith, who are involved in the various issues that confront us all, that we must all deal with as members of the church, as faithful adherents, as loving Catholics, to me this is a very, very critical paragraph from these many years ago from St. Thomas. No matter how much one is afflicted, one ought always to have hope in the assistance of God and have trust in him. If therefore Christ delivered those who were in hell, what great confidence ought all friends of God have that they will be delivered from their troubles. There are a number of things that speak to me there about the real nature of hope. All of them bound up in the glorious image of Christ, sharing friendship with the patriarchs and all other good and just men. It's a sharing that expresses pure charity, Christ extending himself in friendship for the sake of others. And what it tells me, what that says to me, is that hope is a collective act. Hope is not confinable to an inward individual wishing for ourselves. It requires reaching out in action for outcome on behalf of others. And it requires that reaching through trust, through firmness in faith, that he who delivered once will deliver us too, that we may imitate that act for our friends and even those who have not yet become our friends. In a wonderful new book called Becoming Wise, an inquiry into the mystery and art of living, the journalist and public broadcaster Krista Tippett, I don't know how many of you know her, she does an amazing podcast and she does work on public radio in the States and has a series of books. But in this new book, Becoming Wise, she talks about leading a life of conversation that prompted her to reimagine the very meaning of hope. And she says, and I love this definition, she says, I define hope as distinct from optimism or idealism. It has nothing to do with wishing. It references reality at every turn and reveres truth. It lives open-eyed and wholeheartedly with the darkness that is woven ineluctably into the light of life, and sometimes even seems to overcome it. Hope, like every virtue, is a choice that becomes a habit, that becomes spiritual muscle memory. And she concludes by calling it a renewable resource for moving through life as it is, not as we wish it to be. Not as we wish it to be. Yet, as we are prepared to extend our friendship to help it become. And we, heeding St. Thomas, are prepared to renew that constantly in the spirit of firm hope in God, even though we know that our most hopeful starts may sometimes seem ineluctably to end in travail and tears, to end, as the book of Ecclesiastes puts it, vanity, vanity. All is vanity and a breath of wind. I wrote recently an article in Convivium on Ecclesiastes, and particularly on a quote from the literary critic Harold Bloom, who calls the book of Ecclesiastes a festival of negation, and says that its religious vocabulary is the expression of a desire to keep God at a sensible distance. I went back to Bloom's characterization of Ecclesiastes that way as a result of something of a funny coincidence, or perhaps not so funny, this summer. I spent part of a day, I'm a photographer, so I was down south of Ottawa photographing wrecked vehicles, wrecked trucks and cars and so on, in a place called the Boneyard. But it's actually this place, it's a most mystical, magical place. It's an old farm. It's a family farm that has been converted into a wrecking yard, except it isn't the conventional thing you think of when you think of the term wrecking yard. It's actually this farm, and the cars and the trucks have been pushed into the trees and into the bushes and into the meadows, and they just sit there, crumbling into the earth. I have a photograph of a license plate, an Ontario license plate from 1968 on the back of this car that is basically just almost all rusted away with tendrils of leaves and so on wrapped around it. The passage of time is palpable in this place. There's an almost organic quality of the crumbling of metal, rusting and disappearing and being slowly consumed by the earth. And as soon as I started photographing these vehicles, and perhaps because of this unexpected context, I was overwhelmed by this feeling of them as artifacts of anticipation, of pride, of status, of accomplishment, and also of pure joy. They were a visible evidence of referencing reality at every turn and revering the truth that all things ultimately come to an end and return to the earth. And I talked to the fellow who owns the Boneyard, which sounds very eerie, but he's this deeply Christian man who's kept his family farm going this way. And he had this wonderful, wonderful description of what happens. He said, his name is Joe Martell, and Joe said to me, you know, sometimes when you walk through there in the morning or at night, you think, that was once brand new. Or someone's kids went to the beach in that car. Or someone came home crying from a funeral in that vehicle. And he said, each car is a story. Each car, as it crumbles into the earth, is a story. So here's the funny part. By coincidence, the next morning, I read Scripture by just letting it fall open where it may and then reading what's there for the day. By total coincidence or not, I let it fall open to Ecclesiastes. And I started reading Ecclesiastes, the idea that all is vanity and that life's toil and trial and trouble is simply not worth it. And so then I went back to Bloom and to Northrop Frye and to some other literary critics to see what they had to say about Ecclesiastes. And I became really, really consumed with it, and I started searching farther afield. And I went on the web and started looking on Amazon for books about it. And I came across a book by a writer. It's a very curious book by a writer named Martin Shields, which I've subsequently determined is actually kind of not exactly part of the accepted literary thinking about Ecclesiastes. But anyway, Shields has a book called, Krista Tiffitt's book's called The Beginning of Wisdom. Shields is called The End of Wisdom, a reappraisal of the historical and canonical function of Ecclesiastes. And he argues in it that Ecclesiastes as a book of Scripture is actually an elaborate scriptural joke for the overturning of the expectation that is established through most of the text. That it, in fact, far from being a festival of negation, the whole thing leads us to the ultimate punchline, which if you will be familiar with, which is, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. In other words, Shields' argument is, keeping God at a distance is not sensible, as Harold Bloom argues. It's actually the ultimate in pointlessness to try to keep God, our whole duty, our whole purpose, our whole function. And that, the book of Ecclesiastes, he argues, that's the message of Ecclesiastes. Where wisdom ends, in other words, firm hope in God begins. As Krista Tippett says, in the beginning of wisdom, it's there that open-eyed and wholehearted living, with the ineluctable interweaving of darkness and light, can truly flourish. It struck me that we attach a dual meaning to the idea of being open-eyed. We think of it on one level as being wary, watchful, on guard against being fooled or even attacked. And we simultaneously, in the wonders of the English language, use it to mean being naive, immature, unschooled, easily fooled, vulnerable to trickery and hocus pocus. But Krista Tippett doesn't mean being wide-eyed that way. And I think she's right not to, especially if we're speaking in the context of hope. What she means, or at least what I hope she means, because it's what I mean, is a willingness to see fully. Not just in some Manichaean notion of white versus dark, or light versus blackness, or some happy-clappy, Jim Dandy, everything's okay, optimistic way. But the way in which the hopeful is discoverable in a cause for being downhearted, precisely because there is cause for being downhearted. Within our downheartedness is our hopefulness. The reason, the justification for being downhearted in a paradoxical, joke-turning of expectations way is actually the cause for hope. And I want to be clear, I'm not talking about that in some silver linings playbook way. I mean in the life and death, joyful sense of Christ going down into hell to save his friends. Not optimism, reverence for capital T truth. So I want to give you a couple of specific examples of where I have seen hope emerging that perhaps may have gone by others, but I think are really, really important that we keep wide-eyed and open to these possibilities. All of us who have been involved in pro-life causes or who are, as we would be in this room, aware of pro-life issues, are probably still susceptible to something approaching despair from rulings such as the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in the Carter case. And there's abundant justification for a festival of negation about that terrible, terrible judicial miscarriage. And Margaret Somerville, who's joined us this evening, there you are, Margaret, we're going to talk tomorrow, and she's, I'm sure, going to give you many, many more ideas and thoughts about why that was such a miscarriage and why there's such a reason to be concerned about it than I've even thought about that. But I want to just point out alongside that, and not as a replacement for it, and this is really important, not as a trade-off for it. This happened, but this happened, therefore we can trade the two of them off and we come out even. But alongside it, as a cause for hope, as the thing in itself, I just point to, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of it, the recent BC Appeal Court decision in the Trinity Western University case. Some of you may have followed it. Trinity Western, for those of you who don't know, has been battling for many, many years to open a Christian-based law school. And it's run into very, very fierce opposition because of its community covenant bindings, both students and staff, to sexual relations within heterosexual marriage. I have to say, personally, I'm not a big fan of community covenants. I have some issues with them. I think, if properly formed conscience moves its own way through the world without kind of formalistic or legalistic signing of documents. But I don't go to Trinity Western. I've never given a dime to Trinity Western. I'm not on staff at Trinity Western. It's their private institution. If that's what they need to do, then I would say, God bless, let them go ahead and do it. And the appeal court said exactly the same thing. But it didn't just say that. It rebuked, and I use the biblical word deliberately, it rebuked the Law Society of British Columbia for being party to stirring up and taking advantage of that fierce opposition. It castigated, and again, I don't use that word lightly, the benchers of the BC Law Society for failing to take Trinity Western's charter rights into account. And it overturned the Law Society's action against Trinity Western, its refusal to license future lawyers. It overturned them on the basis of their neglect of Trinity Western's charter rights. Now that's important, it's very important, and I think, and Margot again will speak much more fully to this than I ever could, but it's important as a point of law in Canada. But there's something even more significant, and that's that the Trinity case in the BC Appeal Court largely drew from the Loyola case, which was a Quebec Catholic high school that went to the Supreme Court of Canada arguing that it could not be prohibited, not be prevented from teaching an ethics and religion course from a true and full Catholic perspective. And the Supreme Court upheld that right. And so the Trinity decision built on the Loyola case. But it went beyond Loyola, and it lined up a series of boxcars of judicial decisions over the last number of years that, in their different way, justify what Madam Justice Abella said in Loyola, which is that the role of a secular state is to foster religious diversity, not extinguish it. Now, those are words for enormous hope for anyone who cares, A, about religious freedom, but also just about the ability to live the life of faith as we are accustomed to living it, and as we demand to live it, as our charter guarantees that we live it. Those are incredibly important words. The fact that they were built on in the Trinity Western case is even more powerful. It's really hard to imagine more hopeful words than those, and we need to be open-eyed to that kind of thing happening within the courts. Does it negate the harm done by Carter? No, absolutely, emphatically not. Except, perhaps, yes. Definitely, probably, maybe. It might. It starts a process of building, and that starts the process, or keeps alive, the process of hope. Again, I'm going to defer to Margot on the legal learning to deal with these kind of things, particularly as it applies to things like medical conscience rights and so on. That is her specialty, and she knows it. I'm not going to try to go there. But for me, what's foundational is that our institutions, much as we might perceive them as being in the grip of wreckage, of disintegrating into the earth, into the grass and the earth, still can function as places of hope, still signal to us the imperative of keeping open-eyed to hope. On touching on institutions, I want to just take a second here to speak of the institution of the church, and in a particular local context with obviously universal application. We all know that the church, as it always is in a time of trouble. It's troubled within, it's troubled without. We know we don't need to spend a lot of time talking about the dilemmas that the church faces. We're all very, very familiar with them. But in the midst of that, and very recently, the bishops in Alberta and Northwest Territories produced a document, and I don't know how many of you have had a chance to read it, but if you haven't, I really urge you to give it your full, careful attention. And if you have, read it again, because I'm certainly going to. It on pastoral approach to those seeking euthanasia and assisted suicide. I wrote a Register column about it in which I described it as the document, the guidelines, as a Christian cry of love. And it truly is that. The depth of charity in the document is not just a rebuttal, it's an overturning of all the castigations that are thrown against our church. The voices, the tone, the words that are chosen, the mechanics of the words and the way they come together are absolutely spectacular, and they deserve reading and rereading and sharing with your friends. Beyond the depth of charity is a degree of discernment that is really it's so empowering. I hate that word, but it just makes you want to be even more of a Catholic than you actually are, because that is our tradition. That level of discernment, that ability to take something and discern what's important, what's not important, what matters, what doesn't matter. It's an absolutely phenomenal piece of work. The mystic Simone Weil, who flirted with becoming a Catholic and ultimately decided not to, said that faith is the knowledge that the intellect is enlightened by love. And this document is the manifestation of intellect enlightened by love. It's the intelligence that it manifests is the great hope of, for, and by the church. And I would, at the risk of being laughed out of here, since I started with a bad joke, I would even go further and say that it's a hope that moves us to the possibility of, again, a faith in politics. And of course, politics are outside the purview of the church, as Benedict said so eloquently in Deus Caritas Est, that politics are not the realm of the church. Justice is the realm of politics. Charity is the realm of the church, but charity must inform the sense of justice that leads to our politics. I think that I'm actually beginning to feel that we are moving, hopefully, into the possibility of restoring some faith in politics. And the question that has to come up, of course, is how we can possibly have faith in politics in the post-Trump election era, even whether you liked him or whether you didn't. The debacle that unfurled was going to lead most people to say, how can we possibly have faith in politics? But if I'm optimistic gusting to naive, I'm still beginning to develop, in the broad aftermath of that election, and in some things that have happened here, a sense of willingness to and an openness to reconsider and even recalibrate some of the social transformation that have swept over us in the last decade, the last generation. And I'll just one example this week, or actually on the weekend, a Columbia University professor named Mark Lila, who is the quintessential liberal intellectual, framed the election outcome in terms of the necessity of re-evaluating the obsession with diversity and identity politics. He comes from that liberal tradition, and what he was not arguing against that diversity or identity politics have a place in politics, but what he was saying that they have overwhelmed the narrative of American political life and what it means to be a full and whole American, and ultimately why that allowed a foul-mouthed, plutocratic, let's pretend populist to become the president and carry the day earlier this month. will that sense of re-examination carry the day? I have no idea. I don't know. But I think that the reemergence of something like that requires us to be open-eyed to it, requires us to be aware that it's happening, and requires us to see it, if not as a fait accompli by any means, as a sign of hope. Another quick example I'll give you is just the emerging story with Professor Jordan Peterson at the University of Toronto, who, whether we agree with him or disagree with him, is standing up vigorously for the charter-protected right of free speech, particularly as a university professor. Now, there's controversy around him. There are people who don't agree with him, who disagree with him, but his foundational point is that he has the right to speak, and he has the right to say, particularly in an academic context, to say what he believes, that he essentially is prepared to say, in the words of someone who's probably not that terribly popular in this room: "Here I stand, I can do no other." So I want to close with two other quick examples. And they're not from politics, they're not from institutions, they're from ordinary people here in Edmonton. From my life and my time here in Edmonton. When I was a young reporter years ago with the Edmonton Sun, I got sent down to do one of the usual mean streets of Edmonton stories. So I went down to Boyle Street to interview a young prostitute about life on the mean streets of Edmonton. So I met this young woman, and we went to a Greasy Spoon to talk, and it was evident within 30 seconds of meeting her that she was young. She was maybe 18, 19 possibly, but she was already as hard as nails. And she said, she was adamant that what she was doing was her choice. It was what, nobody had any right to tell her to do differently. Her life was her life, and leave her alone. And she was utterly, truly defiant about what she was doing. So I asked her if that was so, what she would do if her sister showed up on Boyle Street. And she said, without blinking, "I'd kick her ass back home." And I said, "Why? Why? I mean, it's a life for you. Why? What's wrong with having it as a life for your sister?" And she looked at me as if I was a complete lunatic. And she said, "Don't you think I'm ashamed of what I do?" And she just looked right through me when she said it. That was 30-some years ago, and I've never forgotten the feeling of those eyes on my face and the sound of those words in my ears. And I want to fast forward to something that's going to seem completely removed from that, completely dissociated from it, but I don't think it is, actually. Last spring, when I was out here in Edmonton to do some stories on the city's response to the Fort Mac fires, I went around and I talked to a whole pile of people, and I listened to some amazing stories about the generosity of people in this city, particularly people motivated by their faith to help. And it wasn't news to me. I mean, I lived here. I know what people in Edmonton are like, but they were really wonderful stories. But the one conversation that always comes back to me, I talked to a suburban mom in a parish here who just got up one morning and had been watching what was happening at Fort Mac on the news, and she threw herself into the task of filling up 10 pickup trucks with food and clothing and necessities for the people who'd been displaced, dispossessed, victimized by the fires in Fort McMurray. So I asked her, why you? Why did you feel that need? Why did you have to? Why was that so compelling for you? She actually had the parish hall filled with this food, and then she roped 10 people to come with their trucks, and they put the food and all the goods in the truck, and off they went. And this is what she said with extreme thoughtfulness. She said, I've always been someone who admired first responders to emergencies, police, firemen, ambulance drivers, paramedics. And when I woke up that morning, I realized that I too am a first responder to the Holy Spirit. And when she said that, I immediately went back to that young woman and the look on her face. And I started thinking that what she was saying to me was a first response to the Holy Spirit, even though she she did not have the awareness of that suburban mom. But that was a response to the Holy Spirit. Do you see the connection there between two seemingly incredibly different people in different circumstances and different lives? To me, the connection is this. It's the human heart. It's the place where hope must live. Don't you think I'm ashamed of what I do? Is shame part of hope? Yes. Yes, yes, it is. Shame moves us to hope. If we feel shame, that in itself is a sign of hope. Just as anger and frustration and joy and laughter are signs of hope. For shame is a sign, even shame, that the Holy Spirit is telling us something better not only exists, but can be responded to. It's calling for us as first responders to first see and then act for the sake of the destiny given us by He who went down into hell for His friends. So, just a few days, maybe a week before Andre died, I was driving with him, and it was very, very late in his life. We didn't know it was a week away, but we knew it was late. And as we were driving, he told me his 4-part joke. Do you know the 4-part joke? So this is what he said. Do you know the 4-part joke? He said, here's the first part of the 4-part joke. A wife is in the kitchen washing the dishes when her husband comes in and points out that she's left some spots on some of the glasses. She turns on him and she says, "Who's washing these dishes, you or me?" He retreats very sheepishly, apologizing, backs out of the room. So Andre says, that's the first part of the 4-part joke. Here's the second part of the 4-part joke. Husband is driving his wife downtown, and she points out that he almost runs a red light. He nearly sideswipes a cyclist. He comes close to knocking down a pedestrian and almost runs over someone in a green hat. He turns to her and says, "Who's driving this car, you or me?" She falls sheepishly silent. That's the second part of the 4-part joke. And then Andre says, "So here's the 4th part of the 4-part joke." And I say, "Wait, Andre, you forgot to tell the 3rd part of the 4-part joke." And he looks straight ahead and says, "Who's telling this joke, you or me?" The joke is a joke about jokes. It's a joke about the way jokes work. It's a joke about the way we make jokes of our expectations by turning them upside down. Especially our expectation for control. Especially our expectation that all things will be well if we wish, and we confuse wishing with hope. They remind us what Ecclesiastes and Aquinas and Chesterton all taught us, that our hope rests firmly and only in the friendship of God. And I hope that wherever he is, my friend Andre is telling his new friends his old jokes and teaching them along the way to fear God and follow His commandments. Thank you. So if you have a question out of that, it's a miracle. Any questions? Anyone? No?
You had just indicated that shame and anger, joy are signs of hope. It seems to me that in our secular society, that hope is seen in the claim to rights.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you care to comment on that.
Hope is seen in the claim to rights?
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not sure that that's actually even an expression of hope. I think it's an expression of power. It's an expression of saying, if not power, it's at least an expression of entitlement, which I think is a very different thing from hope. It's an expression that says, this belongs to me, rather than, as Krista Tippett said, this is what is part of life. This is the stuff of life, whether it's good, whether it's bad, whether it's indifferent. It's what is. It's what's in front of me. And I think that's very different from much of what we deal with now as an argument from rights. In fact, I guess I would say it, in a short way. I think that much of the argument for rights, the way it's presented at least, is the antithesis of hope. We can find signs of hope, but I think the argument itself is very often the opposite of hope. Uh-oh.
Peter, what you said brought to mind that, we speak of making peace and making war, and I think we have to make hope. I think we've been too passive about it, and that we've got to think about ways that we can do that. And your talk also brought to mind, because you talked about people who were dying and who didn't have any hope, and that sometimes there's a lot of concern, well, maybe they're depressed. And there's some really excellent work done by Dr. Harvey Max Chochinov, who's a psychiatrist who specializes in the psychiatry of dying people. And for any of you who don't know him, he's based in Manitoba. But actually last week I did a joint presentation with him at the University of Notre Dame in Sydney, Australia, where I've now moved back to. And what they found in this research, they looked at a number of people, I can't remember if it was 40 or 50, who were saying things like they would like to have euthanasia, and then they diagnosed them tried to as to whether they were depressed. And what they found was that the distinction between the ones who wanted euthanasia and the ones who didn't was not depression. It was the ones who wanted euthanasia were not depressed. They had a condition that they named hopelessness, that these people were hopeless. So it's extraordinarily important that we can now look for real ways that we can implement hope, not just talk about it as though, not that that's what you've done, but not just talk about it as though it's this airy-fairy thing and we're lucky if it happens, but if it doesn't, there's not much that we can do about it. And it also, listening to you, I wondered whether your friends telling of jokes wasn't a way to overcome hopelessness. That it gave, because we know that to have hope, you've got to have some sense of connection to the future. And people feeling that they've got some legacy helps them to go on still having hope even when they're dying. And maybe he kind of knew. He told you this joke, because I know you well, and I know that you write all these wonderful things. And he probably thought, oh, Peter will remember that, and he'll use that, and that's just what you've done tonight.
I would say, Margot, that I think that what you said is right. I guess where I would maybe nuance it a bit, or just clarify it from my own perspective, is that I do think that Andre was doing that as a means of combating hopelessness, not in himself, but in others, as a means of spreading hope. And in that sense, and vis-a-vis the whole euthanasia debate, he was mobilizing hope in a transformative way, because hope is transformative. That's the difference to me between life as we in the church see it, understand it, necessarily ending, and euthanasia and assisted suicide. They are technological responses. Our response is a transformative response, an openness to that hope. And so I agree with you, but I think Andre's concern would have been an outwardly expressed concern. He was prepared to go down into hell for his friends if necessary, if someone else hadn't already got there for him. And I think that's where the jokes and the hope and the relationship between the two really begins. And not to belabor it any further, but a man in, we're told, intolerable suffering, whose first thought is the comfort of others, because a joke is can be a comforting thing, right? It's a disarming thing. You tell it, and people can have a way to relax. So yeah, no, I agree with that. In terms of making hope, I think that's exactly right. But I don't think making hope is necessarily, it's neither airy-fairy nor the huge, large, important gesture that everybody sees. I think it can be recognizing in the words of that young woman. I mean, that was a very hopeful thing for me to hear her say that, because to hear someone who on the surface seemed that hard-bitten, already almost dead, at least in a spiritual sense, still have that impulse in her heart. I've carried that hope with me for 30 or more years. I have no idea at all what became of her, and I don't want to be Pollyannish that it was some wonderful thing. Nevertheless, to me, that's where the hope resides, even in words that are seemingly given in context that are that harsh. So the making of hope is actually recognizing it, living it out, and as the woman here did, responding to it as a first responder to the Holy Spirit. It doesn't have to be, a great big gesture. Are there any other questions?
I found your discussion on hope fascinating. I'm a huge believer in hope, and my hope, and if I understood you correctly, you tie hope quite closely to a belief in the transcendent, to something beyond. And I'm involved in Catholic education, and we get a lot of young people who are bought into the secular mystique of the world, or it's not even mystique, it's nothing. That's the issue. How do we lead secular people to hope when there is nothing beyond, no transcendent?
Yeah, it's a really, really tricky question. How do you restore a vocabulary? I mean, it is almost like one of those conundrums where 6 people are left speaking a language. How do you A, preserve it, and B, then start re-inculcating it in a rising generation, so that they can speak it again? It reminds me, it's just totally unrelated, but when I took my son went to Oxford a number of years ago. I took him there, and when I arrived, there was a guy walking down the street with a book under his arm, and I saw the title of it, and it said, "Selected Medieval Welsh Poetry." And I thought, my goodness, I'm glad he doesn't have the complete volume, because his arm, how much selected medieval Welsh poetry can there be? But anyway, my point is that we get down to rarefied levels, and it becomes hard to sustain things. And this is difficult, because my own prescription is to start speaking exactly in terms of the transcendent, and in putting things in front of young people that make them go, for example, art, that make them stop and go, wait a minute, this isn't about me. That's not a mirror. That's not, how wonderful I am. That's something that exists outside of me. Where did that come from? Beauty will save the world. And to start that elementary process of reflection, and that is fraught with peril, because it can become a kind of mushy, pantheism or paganism, or wherever it might lead. Oh yeah, we'll worship the rocks and the stones and the dirt and the blah, blah, blah. But we are at a point where we're almost going to have to, I don't know, but even almost, we're going to have to take that risk. I was mentioned that I'm involved with a project called Faith in Canada 150. One of the ideas we had that we just weren't able to get funding for was a series of photographs of sacred spaces that would include that kind of thing, just for the power of stopping people walking through a business center in Toronto and saying, that is something that's outside of me. And that's how elemental I think the vocabulary has to become, in terms of training people out of the slim volume of medieval Welsh poetry to a more generally accepted vocabulary. Is that answer? Does that help? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I was interested in the appeal case that Trinity Western University brought against the Law Society of BC. Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you anyway. That's okay. Oh.
Is that better? No.
Your voice is good enough.
I can just speak loud.
That's fine. That's fine.
I'm talking about the case of Trinity Western and the Law Society of BC, which I've heard about, but I didn't realize they had won the appeal.
Yeah.
And I'm in the medical profession, and of course what we're concerned about is conscience rights. And there's a case, I'm not sure exactly how it's going forward, but against the College of Physicians and Surgeons in Ontario, and probably the Ontario government, regarding the right of conscience of physicians and institutions to not provide euthanasia, and what we do about that. And I was thinking, that's really hopeful for us, but what is your view on it?
Yeah, this is one where it does get a bit tricky because the Ontario Appeal Court upheld the Law Society in that province. Although, and again, Margot is certainly better equipped to talk to it than I am, but a number of lawyers that I've talked to say that that Ontario decision is so limited and it is so tightly framed that it will not have that significant an impact. The BC decision really goes wide on the charter. Even in the Ontario decision, they acknowledge that to prevent Trinity Western grads from practicing law in Ontario is a violation of freedom of religion. They find other reasons to justify it, and I'm told that the strategy will be the minute Trinity graduates its first lawyer, that person will make a beeline to Ontario, and there'll be a charter case, and it'll fight its way through the courts. But I would say, in terms of the BC decision, because of what it accorded Trinity as an institution of like-minded people and of people of faith and people, whose rights are protected by the charter. My understanding from the legal minds, including some of the people I know who were interveners, lawyers who intervened in the case, it could have a very, very, very positive effect on a lot of the conscience arguments. They in fact kicked the daylights out of the Ontario. The appeal court in BC actually took a real kicking at the Ontario decision, and they actually mocked some of the arguments from the Law Society. The Law Society, this is getting into a bit green eye shade argument, but the Law Society had argued that it wasn't in effect preventing Trinity from opening a law school, it was only refusing to license lawyers. And the court actually says in the decision, the Law Society seems to have forgotten that the purpose of a law school is to train lawyers. That's actually its function. So to refuse to license them actually does defeat the purpose of the law school and actually forces it to be closed down. All of that to say, the language, the tone, and the arguments that are used, I think, and I'm told, have very, very positive benefits for a lot of the conscience arguments that are going forward. Any other questions? Anything on the media? No? Okay. No. I was just going to say, is there anything happening in the media anyone wants to know about? I don't know anything, so. Where's the Western Catholic Reporter? No, it's fine.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Just say a closing.
Yeah.
So in closing, I'd just like to thank all of you for coming tonight, and also, of course, in a special way to thank our speaker this evening, Peter Stockland. You've shared with us, I think, a lot of wisdom and given us an account of hope, which is not Pollyannish at all. but spiritual, ethical, and profoundly realistic. And this is a very suitable introduction, I think, for our discussions that will continue tomorrow on euthanasia, as all of the political and legal elements of those questions, as important as they are, I don't think we can really wrestle with those apart from an account of hope along the lines that you've suggested to us tonight. So thank you very much for that. And also, just along that line, in terms of a few housekeeping items, I just invite you to fill out the blue evaluation forms before you go tonight. You can leave them in the box at the registration desk that you passed on the way in. And for those joining us tomorrow, we'd invite you to come around 9:30 or 1:45, so you have time to get settled, and the lecture will start with Margaret Somerville tomorrow promptly at 10 a.m. In conclusion, let's just take a moment and once again thank Peter for his wonderful talk.
Good, thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. That was
Thanks.
wonderful.
Oh, good, thank you. I'm glad it worked.
Very rich. I do have a form for you to fill out.
Okay, yeah.
Michelle,